There's a moment in every public controversy where the facts stop moving, but the story does not. That is where this situation now sits. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but in the space where outcomes are pending and interpretation begins to take over. And in that space, something subtle starts to happen. People stop asking what is confirmed and start asking what feels likely. That distinction matters, because what feels likely is shaped by narrative. What is confirmed is shaped by evidence. And those two rarely move at the same speed. Right now, the Whittaker case exists in that gap. There are charges, there are timelines, there are public statements, and then there are assumptions. Assumptions about what will happen next. Assumptions about who is responsible. Assumptions about who will be held accountable and who will not. And one of the strongest assumptions currently circulating is this: that one person may walk away, while another takes the full weight of what happened. But before accepting that idea, it is necessary to slow down and examine the structure underneath it. Because outcomes in cases like this are rarely about emotion. They are about leverage. And leverage is built from three things: evidence, position, and timing. Start with evidence. What has actually been documented? Not what has been suggested. Not what has been implied. But what has been established clearly enough to be acted upon. Because public conversation often expands faster than verified information. Statements are made. Screenshots circulate. Claims repeat. And repetition creates a kind of false solidity. Something begins to feel true, not because it has been proven, but because it has been said enough times. That is the first distortion. Now consider position. In any shared situation involving responsibility, position determines exposure. Who was visible? Who was documented? Who was directly tied to decisions, actions, or outcomes? Because in complex situations, responsibility is rarely distributed evenly. Even when multiple people are involved, the system tends to isolate the point of strongest proof. Not necessarily the full truth, but the most provable version of it. And that is where cases often narrow. Not toward fairness, but toward what can be demonstrated. Now at timing. Timing shapes pressure. If one person is addressed first, the second person enters the situation under different conditions. The narrative has already formed. The expectations are already set, and that can influence how everything that follows is interpreted. So when people begin asking, will charges be dropped for one person? Will another person take the fall? What they are really asking is this: where is the strongest combination of evidence, position, and timing? Because that combination determines direction, not opinion. Now bring this back to the Whittaker situation. Two individuals became central to the story. Two individuals made promises. Two individuals were present during key developments. Two individuals became associated with outcomes that did not align with expectations. And yet, the path forward does not necessarily treat them equally. That is what creates tension. Because public perception often works on balance. If two people are involved, people expect two people to be held accountable in equal measure. But legal and procedural systems do not operate on balance. They operate on proof. And proof does not always distribute evenly. This is where speculation begins to grow. Because when people sense imbalance, they try to correct it through narrative. They begin to assign roles. One becomes more responsible. The other becomes less so. One becomes central. The other becomes peripheral. And slowly, the complexity of the situation starts to compress into a simpler question. Who is the one that will actually face consequences? But that simplification comes with a cost. It removes nuance. Because the original situation was not simple. It involved multiple interactions, multiple decisions, multiple points where different outcomes could have occurred. And reducing that to a single outcome, a single person, risks losing the structure of what actually happened. Now consider another layer. Time. Time changes perception. In the early stages, everything feels immediate, urgent, reactive. But as time passes, something else happens. Distance creates reinterpretation. People begin to revisit earlier events with new assumptions. They look back and ask, was that moment as it seemed? Was that decision as innocent as it appeared? Was that explanation complete? And this retrospective analysis often reshapes the narrative more than the original events themselves. Because people are no longer reacting. They are reconstructing. And reconstruction introduces bias. Not intentionally, but inevitably, now placed it against the current moment. Months have passed. Information has slowed. Updates are limited. And in that absence, interpretation expands. People begin filling gaps. Some based on logic. Some based on intuition. Some based on alignment with what they already believe. And gradually, those interpretations begin to solidify into positions. Positions that feel certain, even when the underlying information is incomplete. That is where the current speculation comes from. The idea that one person may be cleared, while another faces consequences. But the question is not whether that outcome is possible. The question is whether the current understanding of the situation is sufficient to support that conclusion. Because possibility and probability are not the same. Something can be possible without being likely, and something can feel likely without being supported. That distinction must be held carefully, because once a narrative locks in prematurely, it becomes difficult to adjust, even when new information appears. Now consider the individuals themselves, not as symbols, not as roles, but as people inside a situation that has moved beyond their control. Because at this stage, control shifts. The narrative is no longer shaped primarily by what they say or do. It is shaped by how their actions are interpreted, by systems that operate independently of them. That changes the experience. Because when control shifts outward, uncertainty increases. And uncertainty creates pressure, not just externally, but internally, because now every outcome carries weight, not just for the present, but for how the entire situation will be remembered. And that is where something else enters. Self-assessment. When someone is placed in a position where outcomes are pending, and time creates space, there is a natural tendency to review, to revisit decisions, to reconsider actions, to measure intention against consequence. And that process does not always align with public perception, because internally, the question is often, what did I believe I was doing? While externally, the question becomes, what did it lead to? And those two questions can produce very different answers. Now expand that outward, because this is not just about two individuals. It is about the Whittaker family, and what happened to them as a result of everything that followed. Because regardless of who is held accountable, the outcome for the family remains the central reference point. Were they left better off? Were they protected? Were promises fulfilled? And if the answers to those questions are uncertain, then the focus shifts from intent to result. And results are harder to reinterpret because they are visible, not always fully understood, but visible. Now return to the present moment. Waiting for May, waiting for updates, waiting for decisions that will define the next stage. And in that waiting, the narrative continues to evolve. Predictions form, positions harden, expectations rise, but the underlying reality remains unchanged. Nothing has been finalized, and until it is, every conclusion remains provisional, which brings the situation back to its most grounded point. Not what is being said, not what is being assumed, but what can actually be confirmed. Because in situations like this, clarity does not arrive gradually. It arrives suddenly, through decisions that redefine everything that came before. And when that happens, the narrative shifts again, not based on speculation, but on outcome. Until then, the question remains open. Not who should be held accountable, but how that accountability will actually be determined, and whether the structure that defines it will reflect the full complexity of what happened, or only the part that can be proven. Because before any outcome is finalized, a parallel process begins to take shape. Not in courtrooms, not in official records, but in public space. And that process often determines how the outcome will be understood, long before it is announced. This is where perception starts to separate from procedure. Procedure follows rules. Perception follows patterns. And those patterns are built from repetition. What people hear repeatedly, what they see emphasized, what gets shared, debated, and reinforced. Over time, repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity begins to feel like truth. Not because it has been verified, but because it has been absorbed. Now consider how that applies here. There are already competing narratives. One suggests that responsibility is shared, but uneven. Another suggests that responsibility may ultimately be concentrated. And both narratives are being shaped in real time, without a final decision yet in place. That is important, because once a narrative settles, it becomes resistant to change, even if new information appears. This is known as narrative inertia. Once people commit to a version of events, they begin filtering everything else through it. Supporting details are accepted quickly. Contradicting details are questioned, minimized, or ignored. So the question becomes, which narrative is gaining momentum? Not which is correct, but which is stabilizing, because that will influence how any future outcome is received. Now examine the current direction. There is increasing discussion around the idea that one individual may carry more direct consequence than the other, not necessarily because of moral judgment, but because of how the situation appears to be structured. And that distinction matters, because moral responsibility and provable responsibility are not always aligned. Someone can be viewed as equally responsible, but not equally provable within a system that requires documentation, clarity, and direct linkage. This creates a gap between what people feel is fair and what the system can actually enforce. And that gap is where tension builds. Now look at how that tension expresses itself. Questions begin to change form. They move from, "What happened?" to, "Why is this happening this way?" And then further, "Is this outcome justified?" At that point, the conversation is no longer about facts alone. It becomes about interpretation. And interpretation introduces variability, because people are not evaluating from the same starting point. Some focus on intention, others focus on outcome, others focus on process. Each of those leads to a different conclusion. Now consider another layer. Visibility. Visibility shapes accountability. Not entirely, but significantly, because what is seen is easier to attach responsibility to. If actions were documented, recorded, or widely shared, they become reference points. They can be revisited, analyzed, and used as anchors. But what about what was not visible? What about decisions made off camera? Conversations not recorded? Agreements not documented publicly? Those elements exist, but they are harder to integrate into a structured case. And when something is harder to prove, it becomes harder to pursue. Not because it didn't happen, but because it cannot be demonstrated in a way that meets required standards. This is where imbalance often emerges, not necessarily in reality, but in what can be formally addressed. Now bring that back to the two individuals at the center of this situation. One may be more directly tied to visible actions. The other may be more indirectly connected through influence, association, or shared involvement. But indirect connection is harder to establish. And in systems that require clarity, direct linkage becomes critical. So when people speculate that one person may face consequences while the other does not, what they are often sensing, whether consciously or not, is this difference in visibility. Not necessarily a difference in involvement, but a difference in how that involvement can be demonstrated. Now consider how that interacts with timing. Because timing does not just affect sequence. It affects narrative weight. The first person to face formal action often becomes the focal point. Their role becomes defined early. Their actions are examined in detail. And by the time the second individual is addressed, if they are addressed, the narrative has already been partially set. That creates a form of narrative gravity. everything that follows is pulled toward the established center. And shifting that center requires new information strong enough to overcome what has already been accepted, which is not easy. Now introduce another factor. Silence. Silence is not neutral. It is interpreted. When individuals stop speaking, reduce visibility, or withdraw from public explanation, that silence creates space. And that space is filled by others. Speculation increases. Assumptions expand. Interpretations multiply. And without direct clarification, those interpretations begin to stabilize. Not because they are confirmed, but because they are unchallenged. Now look at the current environment. There has been a reduction in clear, consistent communication. Fewer updates, less direct explanation, more reliance on second-hand interpretation. That creates uncertainty, and uncertainty accelerates narrative formation. Because people prefer a conclusion, even an incomplete one, over prolonged ambiguity. So they begin constructing explanations that feel coherent, even if those explanations are built on partial information. Now consider the psychological side, because this is not only about structure and systems. It is about how people process unresolved situations. When something feels unfinished, the mind attempts to complete it. It looks for patterns. It fills gaps. It assigns meaning. And once that meaning is assigned, it becomes difficult to reverse, even when new information contradicts it. This is why early narratives are so powerful. They set the baseline. Everything else is measured against them. Now bring that back to the central question. Will one person be cleared while another is held accountable? At this stage, that question is not being answered by confirmed outcomes. It is being shaped by perceived patterns. Patterns of visibility. Patterns of communication. Patterns of who appears more exposed. But perceived patterns are not the same as verified conclusions. They are indicators, not answers. And treating them as answers introduces risk, because it can lead to premature certainty. Now step back again, because the situation is larger than the individuals involved. It includes the Whittaker family, and their position within this narrative is unique. They are both central and silent. Central to the story, silent within the current conversation. And that creates another imbalance. Because when the primary subjects are not actively shaping the narrative, others do it for them. Creators, commentators, observers, each adding interpretation, each reinforcing a version. And over time, those versions begin to define the reality people believe, even if they are incomplete. Now consider what that means for outcomes. Because when decisions are eventually made, they will not arrive in a neutral environment. They will arrive in a space already shaped by expectation. If the outcome aligns with the dominant narrative, it will feel justified. If it contradicts that narrative, it will feel questionable, even if the underlying decision is based on evidence. This is the power of preformed perception. It does not change the decision, but it changes how the decision is received. Now return to where this leaves the situation. Unresolved, active, interpreted, and moving toward a point where interpretation will meet confirmation. But until that point arrives, everything remains in motion. Not the facts themselves, but the meaning attached to them. And that meaning is being shaped right now, not by verdicts, but by repetition, emphasis, and the gradual stabilization of narrative. Which leads to the next question. Not who will be held accountable, but how the current narrative will influence what people believe that accountability should look like before it is ever defined. Because there's a point in every public situation where the story people believe starts to matter more than the facts still being determined. Not because facts disappear, but because belief stabilizes faster than truth. And once belief stabilizes, it begins to guide interpretation. Everything new is filtered through what people already think they understand. Now apply that to the current moment. There are two parallel timelines unfolding. One is procedural. It moves slowly. It follows structure. It depends on verification. The other is narrative. It moves quickly. It fills gaps. It depends on perception. And the problem is, these two timelines are no longer aligned. The narrative has already moved ahead. The procedure has not. That gap creates pressure, because when the story feels complete, but the process is still ongoing, people begin expecting outcomes that match the story they've already accepted. And if the outcome does not match, something feels wrong, even if the process was followed correctly. That is the risk now forming. Now consider how this connects to the idea of one person being cleared while another is held accountable. That idea did not emerge from confirmed results. It emerged from pattern recognition. People observed differences. Differences in visibility. Differences in communication. Differences in perceived involvement. And from those differences, a conclusion began to form. Not final, but directional. But pattern recognition has limits, because patterns are only as accurate as the information they are built on. If the information is incomplete, the pattern is incomplete. And incomplete patterns can still feel convincing. That is what makes them dangerous. Now introduce another factor. Expectation. Expectation is not neutral. Once people expect a certain outcome, they begin to emotionally invest in it. They prepare for it. They argue for it. They defend it before it happens. And that investment changes how they respond when reality arrives. If the outcome matches expectation, it feels correct. If it does not, it feels like something has gone wrong, even if it hasn't. So the question becomes, what are people preparing themselves to believe? Are they preparing for a balanced outcome? Or are they preparing for a divided one? Because that preparation will shape the reaction. Now consider the individuals again, not as symbols of guilt or innocence, but as participants inside a system that is narrowing its focus. Because as time moves forward, systems tend to simplify. Not because situations are simple, but because resolution requires clarity. And clarity often comes at the cost of complexity. So multiple layers are reduced into fewer defined points. Fewer individuals. Fewer actions. Fewer conclusions. That is how resolution becomes possible. But it also means something important. Not everything is carried forward equally. Some details remain central. Others fall away. Not because they are irrelevant, but because they are harder to integrate into a clear outcome. And that is where perception can diverge again. Because what people remember as important may not be what the system is able to act on. Now bring this back to accountability. Accountability, in public conversation, often means fairness. Equal responsibility. Equal consequence. But accountability, in structured systems, means something else. It means demonstrable responsibility. What can be shown? What can be linked? What can be sustained under scrutiny? And those are not always the same thing. So when people say, if one is responsible, both should be, what they are expressing is a moral framework. But the system operates on an evidentiary framework. And when those two frameworks do not align, tension is inevitable. Now consider the role of time again. Because time does not just delay outcomes. It reshapes understanding. The longer a situation remains unresolved, the more space there is for reinterpretation. Early impressions fade. New theories emerge. Confidence shifts. And over time, people begin to forget which parts were confirmed and which parts were assumed. That blurring is already happening. Details that were once questioned are now repeated as if they were established. And once that happens, correcting the narrative becomes difficult. Because people are no longer comparing against facts. They are comparing against what they believe to be facts. Now step back and look at the broader picture. This situation is no longer just about actions taken in the past. It is about how those actions are being understood in the present, and how that understanding will shape the meaning of whatever comes next. Because outcomes do not exist in isolation. They exist inside interpretation. And interpretation determines legacy. Who is remembered as responsible? Who is remembered as secondary? Who is remembered at all? That process is already underway, even before any final decision is made. Which leads to a final question for this part. Not who will be held accountable, but whether the outcome, whatever it is, will reflect the full reality of what happened, or only the version of it that could be proven, processed, and resolved. Because those two are not always the same. And the difference between them is where stories like this continue long after the official ending is written. By this point, the situation is no longer defined by what happened. It is defined by what remains. What remains unresolved? What remains unconfirmed? What remains interpreted differently depending on where you stand? And this is where outcomes begin to take shape, not as facts yet, but as expectations solidifying into belief. Because when people have waited long enough, they stop asking what will happen and start deciding what must have happened. That shift is subtle, but critical. It moves the story from open to closed, before any official conclusion is reached. Now consider what that means for the idea currently circulating. That one person may walk away, while another absorbs the consequence. At this stage, that idea has gained traction not because it has been confirmed, but because it feels structurally plausible. It fits the visible pattern. One appears more exposed. One appears less so. One has been positioned closer to the center of scrutiny. And once a pattern feels consistent, people begin to treat it as direction. But direction is not destination. And mistaking one for the other creates a false sense of certainty. Now introduce one final layer: outcome acceptance. Every situation like this eventually reaches a point where a decision is made. Charges move forward, or they don't. Responsibility is assigned, or it isn't. And when that moment comes, the public response will not depend only on the decision itself. It will depend on how closely that decision matches the narrative people have already accepted. If it aligns, it will feel justified. If it doesn't, it will feel incomplete, even if it is procedurally correct. That is the quiet power of expectation. It does not change what happens, but it changes how what happens is understood. Now return to the center of all of this. Not the speculation, not the predictions, but the outcome for the Whittaker family. Because regardless of who is held accountable, the original purpose, the stated intention, was improvement, stability, support, a better situation than before. So the most grounded question is not who wins, who loses, but this: did the outcome match the promise? And if that answer remains unclear, then the story does not resolve with a decision. It continues. Because in the end, accountability is not only about consequence. It is about whether the result reflects what was said would happen. And that is the one measure that cannot be reduced by narrative, timing, or perception. It either did, or it didn't. And everything else follows from that. At the end of all of this, the question does not resolve itself through speculation. It resolves through contrast. Not what was said, but what remains. Because once the noise fades, once the debates slow, the predictions stop, and the outcome is finally defined, what is left is simple: a comparison. What was promised, and what actually exists. That is the only stable reference point. Everything else, arguments, narratives, alignments, moves around it. Now consider how this applies. There were expectations that the Whittaker family would be supported, that their situation would improve, that involvement would lead to stability, not disruption. Those expectations were not abstract. They were repeated, reinforced, accepted. And once expectations are accepted, they become a standard, not legally, but morally. So when the situation shifts, when outcomes appear uncertain, when the family's position becomes less clear, the question naturally returns to that standard. Not who said what later, not who defended what position, but whether the original intention translated into reality. Because intention alone does not define outcome. Execution does. And execution leaves traces. Visible ones. Where people are now. How they are living. Whether conditions improved or deteriorated. Those are not interpretations. Those are results. Now bring this back to accountability. Because by the time any official decision is made, two versions of accountability will exist. One defined by process, charges, rulings, conclusions based on evidence that can be proven, and another defined by outcome, whether the situation, as a whole, reflects what people believed it would become. And those two versions may not match. Someone may be cleared procedurally, but still questioned publicly. Someone may be held accountable formally, but seen as only part of a larger issue. That is the complexity at the end of cases like this. There is no single resolution. There is a legal one and a narrative one, and they do not always arrive at the same place. Now step back one final time, because beyond individuals, beyond outcomes, beyond speculation, there is a broader pattern here. What happens when private lies become public stories? When attention becomes influence? When influence becomes control? And when control operates without clear structure? At first, it feels like exposure brings opportunity. Help arrives. Resources appear. Awareness grows. But without boundaries, that same exposure can destabilize what it intended to support. Too many voices, too many directions, too little coordination, and eventually, the original purpose gets lost inside the process. That is the part that often goes unexamined. Not just what happened, but how easily it became something else. Now, as everything moves toward a conclusion, one question remains more important than all the others. Not who is blamed, not who is cleared, but whether the people at the center of the story, the ones who never asked for any of this, ended up better off than they were before it began. Because if that answer is uncertain, then the outcome, regardless of what it says on paper, will never feel complete. And that is where stories like this do not end. They settle, not into resolution, but into a quiet, unresolved understanding that something larger than a decision was at stake, and that the final judgment will not come from a single moment, but from what remains true long after the attention is gone. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.